Hey, this course is about event storming, and the name sounds funny, but in the end, it's a workshop format that I use before I start to create a tracking plan for a company but it's also a very useful tool if you developed a tracking plan internally to gather all the different kind of stakeholders into a room and then come out with a result, which sometimes is a bit difficult. But this workshop format is, I would say, the easiest workshop format that I know, but it's the most powerful one that I know because it makes it possible to bring in all the knowledge and input from all the different kind of stakeholders about a process that is happening within your business, within your product, and so on. And it's a good way to summarize. And what I want to show you in this course is how event storming is basically set up, which is pretty simple. And then we do a sample session. So we pretend we are an e-commerce business. And so we basically now pretend we have all the different stakeholders of this e-commerce business in our house, in the room, and we do the meeting. And so I will showcase you what could be like a typical result and how you can work with it and so on. This is not a religion. You can adapt it to a way that works for you. You can even simplify it a little bit. So I also don't use really like the original implementation of it. But for me, this is one of the most powerful workshop formats that I work with. And I basically use it everywhere and also like to create tracking setups. It's also very useful if you create data models and processes later for data activation, and so you can use it throughout the whole data journey. So we now have a little bit in mind that we want to create a tracking plan afterwards, so we focus a little bit more on what's happening there, but in the end, all the information that we already collect here can then be used to create a data model, to create some reporting. And in the end, it's also like just a map how your business and product is working. So even for that, it's already great. I will summarize a little bit here. Let's first have a look. Event storming. This nice little website. This is Alberto Brandolini. He basically came up with the idea for event storming. As far as I know, he is a software architect, I think in the domain-driven design space, because this is like where this originated, where it's also very useful. And so he wrote a blog post, and he still has it here, like in 2013, where he was describing his approach, how he is doing event storming. And so was he thinking about event storming? Okay, in software architecture, especially if you want to go into microservice architecture and event-driven architecture, so of course you have to know what kind of events are happening. And domain-driven design, you need to know what kind of events are there and how you group them into specific kind of domains. This kind of background is not so important for us if we want to go into tracking or data definition, but I just wanted to show you who he is. And also he has a resources page. And I highly recommend, if you want to go deeper and really want to see more context, more examples and so on, definitely watch one or two of his presentation, which are really good and usually pretty entertaining. So like the 50,000 orange sticker 80, which is a good summary of his experiences to use this kind of workshop format over, I think, 3 or 4 years with a lot of experience. And he did this very long, very often, and so on. So let's go back. What is it? How I use it? Of course, I already said event storming is a workshop format. And important thing is it depends a little bit on what kind of topic you do. Alberto has a format which he call like the big picture format, which is basically doing the big picture of your company. And this can be pretty big. And so usually he is, I think, very much promoting to do this kind of format physically in one room with a lot of people. And he's absolutely right about this. This performs best if you don't do it online, which I always do. I do it always online because I'm rarely somewhere where my clients are working because they are spread throughout the world. But most effectively, this format is really like when everyone is present. And why is that? Just maybe discuss what you do in this format. So what you basically do is you map out how, let's say, how your business works or a process. Of course, it can also be like a zoom in into a specific kind of process or a specific kind of department, how it works. It doesn't have to be the full business. But you could also map out your full business, and we do a little bit of this kind of mapping in a second. And the interesting thing is you do this usually, if you do it in a room, you do it on a huge wall. And on this wall, you put a huge paper on there. A roll of paper, you roll it along the whole wall. And then you do one thing, and this is like the major asset of this, is you just put in a timeline. So these are the assets. So the biggest asset is the timeline. And in the end, the timeline is just one line across the whole paper. Or if we're now on virtual whiteboards, it's just this one here. And you will see this in action in a second. So just a timeline. That's it. Because what we want to do is what you do in event stormings. You look, let's say you look on a business or on a process from the first thing that happens in this process until the state where the process basically is finished. Or a state where you would say, okay, not your business is finished, but basically a cycle through your business, like our customer journey, is finished up. And maybe you might start in the beginning again. This is what you put on a timeline. This is why the timeline is super important. And if you do it physically in a room and you look on a big picture of a company, you will have different kind of areas. So there might be an area where, for example, accounting is involved. Then there's an area where marketing is involved. Then there's an area where sales is involved. And the big benefit of doing this with a lot of people, and if you do this big picture, when you have a lot of people, let's say 20 to 30 people, is everyone is contributing. This is one important thing about it. So like it's not like that one is leading and putting everything on a thing. So like it's everyone, in best case, is contributing. So if you do it physically, it's basically really everyone gets posted in their hands and they just write things there because they know. The cool thing about this kind of format is you bring in different kind of stakeholders and people with different kind of knowledge background to look on a process and to basically let them show what happens in their area. And this could be like also 3 or 4 people who know about this area, and the good thing about if you do this in the room, they basically will group in a specific place there because they know, for example, accounting comes later in the process, so they group around in this place and they do all the accounting activities and events that are happening there. And so you can really spread out your company across the room on this thing. So if for tracking plan cases, it's a smaller use case, you don't need so much space, and you can definitely do this online as well. I do this all the time and it works pretty well. The only thing which I often don't do when I'm doing it online is I don't go into this everyone is contributing thing, because like I have my workshops time box usually on 2 to 3 hours. And of course I could try to invest the first half an hour to explain how this whole concept is working, what kind of things would people put on it, or I can just let them talk and basically do the documentation myself in this kind of format. I usually do the second one because it's usually quicker and I'm quicker with understanding what kind of systems. If I would have this the whole day, I'm pretty sure I would let just everyone put their things into it, because it usually, if people are contributing themselves to it, it usually opens up more levels of knowledge. So it usually let the people go deeper into it, because when they write down, they remember, actually there's something else. So in tracking plan, we don't do process design here. So for us, it's not super important that we know each small step within these kind of things, because we also want to design a tracking plan, a first version of a tracking plan that has a little bit more of a higher level. For us, it's not important to know, okay, actually, which kind of small steps are happening between when a customer, let's say in e-commerce, has submitted an order and then until this order is shipped. But of course, if you do software design, all these different small steps in between are super important to know. I would definitely design this kind of workshops based on the granularity and like the detail level that you want to know. And it definitely helps. So if you need a lot of details, take a lot of time. Definitely this is then a work one day workshop that you go into it, and then really use the first hour to basically empower everyone with this, and then let everyone really contribute to that. And so this is definitely possible. But if you just want to do a tracking plan thing, so you can also say, okay, I'm leading this. I'm basically, or not leading, but it's more like you are more like the moderator and facilitator. So you make sure that all the post-its are landing on this kind of map. Sometimes it can make sense, especially when it's a bigger group, that you are two people who do this, so that there are two people who are basically, you ask a lot of questions, people will talk and will give you a lot of context, and so that you have two people who are basically sparing the work to put everything on this map to do it as seamless as possible. But that's it. In the end, we have a timeline, and then we have post-its. We have different kind of post-its that we use to map out different things. And we will have a post-it, and this is, of course, this is the center thing. I use a lot. We have a post-it for events. These are usually like, in event storming, they use a specific kind of color coding. Is this important? No, of course it's not, as long as you know what you use. But it makes sense to put different kind of information, different kind of colors. And of course, if you want to make it easy, you can just use the one that event storming is already using. I usually adapt it a little bit to my use case. So of course, but I always have events. So events are basically like the cornerstone, which when we go through, then sometimes this is interesting, not so often it's like an action, because interesting, of course, an action is then leading to an event. It could be interesting to define what is happening just before an event that triggers the event. What kind of action is happening that triggers the event? So in software, super important. In data, not so much important. So this is why I rarely use it. Then basically, this is something I use a lot. What kind of data, what kind of information is basically connected to this kind of event or to the action? And so this, of course, it's important because we talk about data, and this already is something when I talk with people about a specific kind of process, this is always they talking about some attributes and so on, which I then would later put into properties to a specific kind of event. So if they come up in the discussions, I will already map them out. Then it could be something like rules or policies. Also something in data, not so relevant. In software design, of course, more relevant. So it might be like that, for example, a specific kind of event can just happen when, let's say, one or two rules apply, so that you basically have a little bit of a state machine, for example. In data can this be as well, so like that. For example, if payment is failed, then a specific kind of event is happening, and of course it's only happening when the payment is failing. Or then it's something that I rarely use in data, but just put it here for completion. It's like the person. So it could be interesting sometimes, but usually it's not, because usually, of course, like when we track a person and we want to track a person, it's often the user, the customer who has logged in, and then this is the major person. In our tracking setup, we don't have different kind of actors, but of course in software design it can be that you have multiple actors who are working with this kind of system. And then one thing which I, of course, use a lot is, let's put it here because it's a special one, are questions or unknowns. This always happens. If you do this kind of session, there might be like a specific kind of event where the people in the room are not 100% sure what is actually happening there, which is also like a very great outcome already of this kind of format. If you just have different kind of points where things are unclear, and then you can basically, people can go back and can investigate, okay, what is it, what happens there, and so on. I use questions a lot because this is really marking out, okay, where are uncertainties, where we maybe have to investigate a lot, or maybe like where we already have a question about a specific kind of data setup that we might use. Yeah, so these are the things. And as you can see, the ingredients are pretty easy. And that's what you do. You just sit down and talk about what's happening on this kind of timeline. And I don't even know what I should tell you more about from a theoretical point. So I would say, let's create one. What we do now is we do a event storming where I'm the only person who's pretending to be different persons, which definitely is something you shouldn't do at home. So we will now pretend we are a team of people who are basically collecting a sequence of different kind of events for different kind of things. Maybe I do another course where I will do this together with one or two other persons so that the more realistic one. But this is the introduction course into event storming, so I can just pretend that I'm one person who knows how a customer journey looks like. So I reduce a little bit the kind of post-it that I use, because these are usually the 4 ones that I use. I don't use actions because in my case it doesn't really make sense. So yeah, this is where I basically start. And what I want to do today is I want to pretend that we are a classic, just an online shop, a random kind of online shop. And I just walk you through an example how I usually collect this. And this takes a while. So when I do this in workshops, this is usually something that takes at least an hour to do. And we will now do it basically in the fast forward version, just to give you an idea how to work with this. Because if you do this with 5 or 6 people, so everyone will have some input and you create a quite big map. And this map is useful for different things. One, this is why I'm doing this, to create a tracking plan, but secondly also to make some process design, and third, to really know, okay, where maybe to plan marketing activities. So don't underestimate this for marketing communication. For marketing communication, this is also like a great thing, because when you know the different kind of steps within a customer journey, you can think about, okay, what kind of, let's say, communication we can do across this kind of journey. So let's start out. So we assume we are an online shop. So where I usually start and where I'm asking people is, okay, where do the users come from? And I don't really define them as event, but more like sources. What's often is, of course, they come from paid search. This is something, then maybe they come from social. So I definitely want to have a clear starting point. And usually the starting point is someone sees somewhere an advertisement. So it can be display ads, it can be influencers. And especially when you look into tracking, this is quite important, because this defines a lot of things that you have to take care of. So for example, influencers, especially when you work with a data model, definitely requires different kind of data modeling than just paid search, where you have a lot data to access to. Influencers, you don't have so much. This can also be, let's say, paid social. Let's start with this. This is where I say, okay, this is where it started. And then I would go and then I would ask, okay, what happens next when someone clicks on this kind of thing? So they say, okay, they land on a landing page, visited landing page. Basically, this would be the kind of next step. And then they tell me, yeah, but sometimes we just also send them to a detail page viewed, or product. It's usually like a product detail page viewed. So it can end up there. This seems to be the 2 entry points where people usually end up when they come to the website. And so then what happens next is usually like that. Of course, a lot of things can happen. So they can go to another product detail page. They might do a search, but this may be interesting. So they do maybe a search, but search, I put it often here a little bit. You will see it in a second, because I want to have at least one linear flow grouped in the middle. And then let's say alternative things that happening in between, I put usually little bit around here. So then of course a search can happen. So they also can discover other products in lists. So this is something that can definitely happen. But at some point someone will do something essential and they will add a product to a cart. And so this is good, because this is something where we want to land. And so this is definitely one of the core things that we know that will happen. What can then also, of course, happen is like when someone can add something, they can remove a product from cart. Then something that also can happen is like they can add a discount to the cart. It's often a place where it happens. They can change quantity, maybe here, quantity. Then at some point someone decides, okay, actually I want to buy this one, start checkout. Then because we asked them, we know this, that we usually ask them, so they might log in, or they continue as guest. Not as quest, as guest, and they might also do something other significant, create a new account. Okay, then they will add payment and they will submit the order, and they will confirm the order. Order is confirmed. Confirmed via email. Interesting. So via email. It's not working good here. Via email, and then order maybe in the end is sent. Sent. And if we go. So I wouldn't really always, what I find really interesting is to not stop at the point where usually the website is stopping. So it definitely makes sense to go beyond. To really see, okay, order is sent, and then let's say order is received. And then what of course can happen is order is returned. And here immediately someone says, yeah, actually they sometimes return some products, but not all. So of course we have the data like the returned products, and also maybe like the returned revenue or total. Let's call it revenue. And this is like the next step where I go into is to check, for example, this could be important. So to check, okay, what kind of rules do you have when an order is returned? So within 14 days. For tracking, this is not so important because in the end, tracking is pretty, let's say, simplistic in this kind of thing. It just tracks when an order has been returned. But for example, for data modeling, it can be super interesting because you want to, for example, if you want to make sure which is fixed revenue, which is basically really happening, it's like you always check in the time, let's say when the order has been sent. So and then you would check, okay, after 14 days, you can assume that the order cannot be returned anymore. And so this is basically now guaranteed fixed revenue before it's like it's potential revenue because it can still be returned. And so there, for example, this kind of rule is super important. And so you can add and extend everything here. For me, the next step is to go through and discuss all the different kind of steps more into details. For example, like how do you send the order? And so then it could be like shipment type or shipment time, if I want to track this. Yes. And for example, login, we will say, okay, what kind of informations do we have when someone is logging in? Of course, we might have a user ID. And we might have, let's say, sometimes you have a score, so you can basically figure out, okay, interesting, they have some kind of score they use. Then we look a little bit into, okay, what do we know about the product? So product page viewed. It's okay, we have product name and so on. So you collect a little bit of things. So this, in the end, it's up to you. So you can handle this kind of format in two ways. So you can handle this as to get a first idea and then sketch out the details later by then looking into documentation or make a test run yourself or whatever. This is how I'm doing it. So when I work with customers, I don't want to block them a whole day to basically go full into details, because for me, like creating a tracking plan is also like it's a collaborative work and it's a step-by-step work, and we can flesh it out later when we go really like into details, when we have the first idea of a tracking plan and then we have it in place, and we usually flesh out a little bit more the properties where we say, yeah, from our experience, this is important. So I don't do this in this kind of format because this would take really long. But of course, if you do this internally and you say, okay, we block ourselves a day and we want to really cover everything, then it makes sense to start out with all the different kind of events and then go into it event by event. So for example, you can define when usually a visit to a landing page is happening. So because like you might only use it in specific kind of cases, and maybe you want to warn a system when people are landing on a landing page from a campaign there they shouldn't be landed, whatever. So it can be different kind of things. If you really want to use this format to already flesh out most of the things that you want to create later, which sometimes totally can make sense because maybe you have one chance to get everyone into a room and afterwards it becomes a bit difficult, and or you want to implement a tracking pretty quickly, so you want to really consolidate your resources. Of course, you get everyone into the room and you basically spend, let's say, a day to flesh out all the different kind of details here. Because the good thing then is like you already have everything in place to create a very detailed and already very precise tracking plan based on that. So both ways are possible. I usually take the, let's say, more high-level approach, where, for example, for me, like the events are more important, and I sketch down, let's say, when people are already telling me about what's happening, and I see them telling them about specific kind of attributes that are important for them, or specific kind of data that is present, then I usually already put it here, because then I already know, okay, I can use it later as properties. One thing that is also really good is like every time when someone is, you see this in the discussion, they are like, actually, where do they start the checkout? And so then they're like, okay, where can you start the checkout? Because then it might be like the people say, yeah, actually only from the cart. And then someone says, no, you can also click on this button in the top navigation. And always note down this kind of questions, because this might be like might be interesting context to also add in the tracking. For example, if you now discover that you can actually start the checkout from different kind of places, then of course it totally makes sense to also use this then as a property. So we would add some data here as well, and then maybe checkout start placement. And then, for example, we would track, okay, if someone is starting it from the cart, or if someone is starting it from the navigation, or whatever. Yeah. This it is. And this is what I mean. This is the simplest workshop format that I know. So you don't really have to train it. And even like people doing it, they don't really have to train it. It's obvious for everyone immediately. And because it's just, you just interview people about specific things they do usually look into every day. So online marketing will know about all these things here. So it's something for them, it's just repeating what they do every week. Store managers know usually everything here. Product managers know what's happening everywhere here, and so on. So it's like talking about people, about what they do every day. And this is usually pretty easy. The good thing about this kind of format is like you bring it in a structure that people can remember and know what kind of things are happening in between. And so this is the powerful thing of this kind of approach, and why I like it so much, and why I use it this kind of often. Use this format before you start to do a tracking plan, especially when you think you are missing context, you're missing some information. If you are totally deep into product and so on, then usually like you can sketch it out yourself, and you can maybe even start with a tracking plan without doing this kind of step in between. But even in that case, I would still recommend to do this, because creating tracking setups is a company work and not a one person or team work. So the more people you get into creating this, the better in the end the tracking plan looks like. And the problem is, if you get everyone in a room without a structure and ask them, okay, what should we track? It's a guarantee for chaos. But if you don't ask them what to track, but more, okay, what's happening here, then it's basically, it's a much better format. Because what comes next is, so you have this huge map, and then you can really define, okay, how do you do different kind of events? And it's not like that you use this as a blueprint to define your events. It's more like this is what you have recorded, and then you model it, and then you abstract a little bit. For example, what I often do is I don't do add to cart or remove to cart or change quantity. It's more, I might have just like cart updated. So I wouldn't do this when we map it out, because when we map it out, we need the precise one. But it might end up that I just call, let's say that I have the entity, like the cart entity, and that I just call it like this. And if I won't do this, if I want to use add and remove, I rarely will have change quantities, either an add or remove. So that's it. But you definitely have to translate it then later in a tracking plan on a different level. But the good thing is, like, when you have this in place, you actually know where you have to end up with which kind of activities. And the good thing is you always can compare. When you have your first version of your tracking plan ready, you can always come back to this kind of map and see, okay, are all the steps covered basically by the tracking plan, or we just forgot something because, oops, there's this search thing. Where do we cover the searching in tracking? And one thing that's definitely important is, if you start with just use this, so this usually gets more detailed than a tracking plan should be. So this is broader, and it's also intended to be as broad as possible. If you do a tracking plan, you basically aggregate more, and you basically, how to say, you bring it on 2 or 3 levels higher. This is important. So don't use this as a blueprint for your tracking plan. Use this as, let's say, an observation for a tracking plan, but the tracking plan then is a new model that is built on top of this observation. So this is important to know. It's very important to creating a tracking plan, but it's basically not already the first version of a tracking plan. It's just like an observation. You watch a video and you are tasked to create a summary. And of course, you don't write when you watch the video what's happening in there. So usually like you do some notes and then you compile these notes into a high-level summary of this kind of video that you were watching before. And so this is the same here. So this is basically the video, the movie, how your company, how a specific process is working. And based on that, you compile a tracking plan. Okay, I hope that was helpful. And let me know if you've done event storming in your company. So I highly recommend just do it. So you can, as you can see, you can use it for plenty of things. So when I was working in product, when we were designing new features, we were using the same kind of format to design the feature to really see, okay, what kind of steps should happen in between. Then, of course, it was a lot more detailed. But this kind of format makes so much sense because it's, everyone understands it immediately, and it's so powerful to later pull out the different kind of information for that.